Hello, my name is Weinblatt. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the Associate Director of Education and Training of Metro New York for Keshet. I am thrilled to be the host of Keshet's new virtual series, Joy and Resilience, Jewish LGBTQ Leaders on What Sustains Us. As LGBTQ Jewish people, oftentimes we need to create our own ways of persevering through tough moments. Surviving and thriving in this world has pushed us to create our own store of unique wisdom about resilience, joy, and community. Each week, our team will invite a different Jewish LGBTQ community leader to join us in a thoughtful conversation about what sustains us and keeps us hopeful. With me today is my colleague, Rabbi Micah Buck-Yael, who will introduce our guest.
Hi, everyone. As Deb said, my name is Rabbi Micah Buck-Yael. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Director of Education and Training here with Keshet. We're so thrilled to have Noam Sienna join us today, and I have the honor of telling you a little bit more about him. Noam Sienna is a Jewish educator, artist, and doctoral candidate in history at the University of Minnesota. He has published on Jewish cultural heritage in scholarly and popular journals and has taught in academic and community venues around the world. He is the editor of A Rainbow Thread, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the 1st century to 1969, published by Printocraft in 2019. Welcome again, Noam. As Debs mentioned earlier, our interview today is about joy and resilience. So get us started. Tell us, Noam, what do those two concepts mean to you, and how do they intersect, and how are they important in your life and work?
Thanks. It's really great to be here, or wherever we are here in my home. And this is a really delightful conversation, resilience and joy. So the first thing that comes to mind to me is that as a historian, I find joy in discovering and being surprised by what history holds. And I think people are often people often have an image of our past, especially Jewish history, especially LGBTQ Jewish history, and especially the intersection of LGBTQ Jewish history, that it is depressing and painful and is not, going to show us any positive directions, that we're like, thank God we're so much better off now than we were in the past. Let's just keep on moving forward. But I'm always surprised when I give myself an honest encounter with the past, with history, and that brings me really deep, immense joy. It brings me joy to know that we don't have to do this on our own. There is a sense of lineage. There's a sense of participating in some kind of shared struggle, some kind of shared question that we're trying to figure out. Like, what does it mean to be who I am in the world? We don't have to answer that question all on our own. And knowing that there were and are people alongside us brings me a great sense of relief. And it also is what allows me to keep moving forward. And that's, I think, where the resilience comes in. I know that there are precedents. I mean, really, if there's one thing that history teaches us, I think it's that nothing really is unprecedented. Like there's always some kind of precedent. I can find a precedent for basically every circumstance. There's somewhere, someone somewhere that faced something similar, if not identical. So what that tells us is that history is not inevitable. Like it's not automatic that there's nothing we can do. We're like stuck in this chain of history that is going to like some predetermined destination. When we look back and realize, wait, other people in other contexts actually faced similar kinds of questions, and they had different answers than we did. So that helps provide us with some space to figure out, okay, are there different ways that we can figure out how to do this? It also brings a kind of responsibility. And I feel like, for me, resilience is also about responsibility. It's about responsibility to the past and responsibility to the future. So it's almost, I don't want to say guilt, but I do feel my ancestors watching me and saying, like, we didn't fight and live and die and do all the things that we did for you to not make choices in your time. Like, you have to do that too, right? And when I think back on all the things that, and I mean ancestors in a very broad sense, not just biological linear ancestors, but like the people to whom I consider myself a descendant of, belonging to a people. So I think, all the things that they faced. Okay, so here I am facing whatever I'm facing. I have a responsibility to get through that, each choice that I make is a response to all of the choices that all of my ancestors made in the past, and it is creating a history for future generations to look back when I'm in the past, God willing, many years from now.
Yeah, that's a really, thank you so much for sharing. This is all so great. I took a lot of notes. I'm curious if you can speak more too about this responsibility and choice. And I'm wondering if it would be helpful just to put in more like specific context of like, Can you think of a specific instance where you've felt that responsibility and you've kind of, I don't want to keep talking. I want to hear from you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think an easy example, although this doesn't, this isn't, the stakes are not particularly high here, but I face this dilemma every time I think about publishing something or writing something or any kind of, putting myself out there. I, like many colleagues, often struggle with a voice inside of me that says, you're not ready, you're not good enough, it's not polished, it's not perfect. What if you're wrong? What if you publish something and it hurts somebody's feelings or somebody is offended? Wouldn't it be better if you just waited? Or wouldn't it be better if you just kept that to yourself and didn't put it out there in the world? So to counter that voice, I say to myself, think of how grateful you are for all of the historical archives that you've been left by your ancestors. And those take all kinds of forms, like things that people wrote, things that people did, things that people left behind them, objects, paintings, stories, newspaper articles, whatever it is. But like, about your past because people left a record. Like, don't you have a responsibility to do the same? So, and think of how much you long to hear from the ancestors that didn't leave a record. Like, I know, both for my own family and for my kind of ancestry generally, there are so many people that I wish they had written something down or left something behind them, even if it was imperfect, even if it was, not fully correct, or even if it was limited or, to their knowledge of the time. Those kinds of things are so valuable, and they're so missed when they're not, so then I think to myself, okay, like, what excuse do I really have for not putting myself out there? So then I think, okay, I'll like press the publish button, press the send button.
I love that. I love that. And it actually, raises another question for me, which is, how do you, with a project like A Rainbow Thread, knowing that so many of our queer ancestors' stories were buried or hidden or told only through the point of view of others, how do you begin the process of looking for those voices, and what do you keep your eyes and ears looking for in order to find them?
That's a great question, and I don't have the perfect answer for this. I don't have a solution, but I can tell you, what I've done is combine a few different things. The first is that I am always interested in expanding the canon, as it were, of where we look when we look for our history, and when we think about like what it means for somebody to be a Jewish historical figure. A lot of people who are not in textbooks or who are not featured in the standard histories of the Jewish people, I spent a lot of time, like when I was researching the book, I spent a lot of time looking in other places. I spent a lot of time looking at newspapers, at community journalism, at family histories and oral histories, and things that were not written in, let's say, prestige Jewish languages, meaning things that were not written in Hebrew or even in a Jewish language like Yiddish, but things that were written in French or in English or in Dutch or Arabic or Persian, and things that were kind of outside of the field. And this is, and I should acknowledge, this is not a technique that I pioneered. This is something that was pioneered by, most especially by the women's history kind of movement, decades and decades ago. Both Jewish women and in general women's history, said, when we're looking for women's history, we have to look for new sources of information. We have to look for new areas of evidence for what it means to have lived, let's say in the Jewish context, like what does it mean to live a Jewish life? For a long time, we had a very narrow vision for what it meant to live a Jewish life. And over the last 40 years, a whole generation of pioneering scholars and theologians and writers and historians have said, let's break open that mold, and let's look for other ways, other records, other kinds of evidence for like what it means to live a Jewish life and what it means to be a Jewish person or a Jewish woman or whatever. So that's something that I've tried to continue in the book, is say, I'm interested in every kind of way that somebody has tried to answer the question, what does it mean to be me? And I'm particularly interested in when that me intersects with LGBTQ identity and Jewish identity in this book. Mm-hmm. That's what I've tried to figure out. So, anyone who fits in the Venn diagram, in the overlap of that Venn diagram, to me is someone who can help me answer that question. So that has meant, people who maybe were completely secular in their approach to Jewish ritual and spiritual lives, but who were nonetheless, I think, like that's one way of answering the question of like what it means to be Jewish. But those people don't always figure in the standard accounts of like LGBTQ Jewish identity when we're trying to think like how do you approach that question. Too often it's like, well, what do the rabbis say about it? Like, what does this rabbi say about it, and what does that rabbi say about it? And it's like, well, that's one way of answering the question, but like, what do other people, I'll give you an example. In Maimonides, in his code of law, the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides says, here are the laws of prohibition of different kinds of sexual activity. And he lists them, and explains them at great length. And he just says when it comes to sexual activity between women. He says, this is totally forbidden. It is not technically forbidden by biblical law, but we can derive it from a different biblical prohibition. So, even though it's not, technically a biblical prohibition, it still requires lashes from a rabbinic court because it falls under this other category. And then he adds, and this is like the last, just like almost like a postscript, he adds, and a man should be careful with his wife regarding this matter and prevent her from joining the women who are known for this behavior. And that's it. And then he moves on to the next category of prohibition. And, that's the kind of source that we might be tempted to say, well, this is like negative. This is like exactly what people expect when they are thinking about history. Like it's homophobic and it's misogynist and it's prejudiced and it's narrow-minded and it doesn't help us and it is offensive and it's triggering and it's hurtful. So we should just throw it in the garbage. But what I'm interested in is saying, wait a second, let's zoom in on that last sentence. Maimonides says, a man should be careful with his wife to prevent her from joining the women who are known for this behavior. In other words, there are women who are known for this behavior. In other words, there are people and he's talking in his context, which is, 12th century Egypt, that there are women in medieval Egypt who are known by their choices to engage in relationships with other women. So if we move the spotlight over from Maimonides to the women that he's talking about, we encounter a whole new set of questions, which to me are much more interesting than any question we could ask about Maimonides, which is, what did it mean for these women? Like, how did they understand their own identity? How did they understand their relationship to Torah? How did they understand their relationship to the Jewish world? Where did they see themselves in the lineage of the Jewish people? What words did they use to describe themselves and their relationships and their partners? How did they find each other? How did they recognize each other? All of those questions are immensely interesting to me. And I'm deeply, one of my deep regrets is that I can't yet answer those questions on the basis of the information that we have. We haven't yet found enough data to be able to answer those questions, but at least we can ask them. We can start asking them, and asking those questions opens up a whole new potential for relationship with our past and with each other and with our relationship to history. And Maimonides, but if we kept the spotlight on Maimonides, it wouldn't get us there. Now, I recognize that that's a heretical position in some circles, right? That I'm saying, the life of an ordinary Jewish woman from medieval Egypt is 100% as equal and valid an understanding of Judaism as Maimonides. Like, for some people, I recognize that that's not true for everyone's approach to the Jewish past. For some people, there's a hierarchy, and what Maimonides says about Judaism is like more true than other kinds of evidence. That's not my personal stance, but I recognize that this approach is complicated for some people.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Sorry, Micah, go ahead.
Well, sort of what that all sparked for me is, I come as a rabbi, a conservative rabbi, a Talmud person, and also from an Egyptian Jewish family. So Maimonides is Maimonides.
Yeah.
And it's so important to be able to zoom back and remember that when the rabbis were writing and speaking, they were talking about a very small slice of Jewish society and Jewish thought. And they created all these tools for answering questions.
Yeah.
And also they were only interested in a small subset of the questions that we have to ask. And I'm wondering, sort of, as you hold both of those things, and so many of the texts you draw in the earlier portion of your book are very similar to that, right? They're at first glance, they look negative or they look painful. And there's almost this way that you're pulling out these hidden voices and the existence of people whose existence we wouldn't otherwise know of because of who is being critiqued by that subset of Jewish thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I mean, this is a problem that is central to the discipline of history. I mean, this is not unique to LGBTQ history. It's not unique to Jewish history. Many historians, especially in the last decade or 2 decades, especially historians who work on marginalized communities, have started to wrestle with, like, how can we write history that honors the silences and absences that are created by the way that the historical record has taken shape. I'm thinking just 2 examples off the top of my head. One is the Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who wrote, I read a lot of him in graduate school, and he says, every particular history is a particular bundle of silences. So when we're creating a historical narrative, whether it's about the Talmud, or it's about the Middle Ages, or it's about 19th century, whatever it is, we are building a story that is shaped around the silences of the stories that didn't get included into the archive. And so we can either ignore that fact and pretend that what's on our bookshelf represents the full history, or we can reckon with that fact and explicitly notice where the holes in our story are. Then, so then what do you do? So that takes me to the other historian that I think really helps us think through this, whose name is Saidiya Hartman. She's a scholar of African-American history. She just won the MacArthur Genius Grant last year. Wow. So she's certifiably a genius, and she really is. And so, when I'm thinking about, like, how do we find resilience and joy in history, Saidiya Hartman's work is for sure a great model for that. I mean, she's writing about slave narratives. She's writing about lost African-American history. She's writing about the Middle Passage. Here's a great hole in our story about America and in our story about, the world. And she says, she develops this tool, which she calls critical fabulation, which I think is just a fancy way of saying midrash. What she's saying is, we have to use the evidence that we have to notice where the holes are in our narrative, and then we have a responsibility to fill those holes with something, story making. That when she says fabulation, she means creating stories that could fill those holes. Now, that's not the same as, historical fiction, where we're pretending like we can just intuit, like, oh, I'm going to make up a story about the past and I'm going to claim that that is the true past. Like, we're acknowledging this is a midrash, this is a fabulation, this is a story that we're telling to fill a hole. We recognize that it is not the true original story, but we have to create it to reckon with the fact that otherwise this hole is going to stay empty. So that's something that feels very deeply Jewish to me about the power of midrash, because it balances in that place, which is, on the one hand, we recognize there's a hole in the story. We recognize that we don't have the evidence or authority to fill it, but we also don't have the luxury of leaving it unfilled. So we have to kind of use our lives and our experiences and our imaginations to put ourselves and our imaginations in that space and fill it up, recognizing that that's always going to be imperfect, and it's always going to be incomplete, and it's always going to be an ongoing project of imagination.
Yeah, well, and that reminds me of what you said earlier of that like craving of the stories that weren't told and how important that is for us as a people. And so I'm curious, because you've written such a revolutionary book, I'm wondering if you've, as people have been reading it and interacting and absorbing these voices that we hadn't heard before, these perspectives, kind of what, if you have specific examples or stories that you can share about folks seeing themselves or having a reignition or a reuniting with their LGBTQ self with Judaism. So I'm just curious, like I feel like you're in a unique perspective to have this kind of feedback with the community.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There are definitely, I've seen so many ways, and I mean, this book has only been out for a year. It's been out just about a year.
Mm-hmm.
And already I've started to see so many ripples of how these stories are like popping up in different places. So I'll just give you two examples that come to mind of pieces that really were quite moving to me. So one story in the book is a story about a person named Ben Rosenstein. Ben Rosenstein was a Polish Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe, came to the United States in the early 20th century, married another immigrant, worked in a factory, moved sort of around the industrial cities of the Midwest, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and got tuberculosis and died in 1915 at the age of 26. So up till now, this is one of hundreds of thousands of similar stories. This is, part of the story of American Jewish history in the early 20th century. So many of these lives leave almost no record. Maybe people's names, their children, end up doing other things and, they're remembered in the family. But for the most part, these factory workers and clothing, tailors and working class builders and painters, don't make a big mark on the historical record. Ben Rosenstein, what happens with Ben Rosenstein is he gets a front page expose the day after he dies in the Chicago Tribune, in which it is revealed the scandalous truth that Ben Rosenstein was actually born and raised as a woman. Mm. So there are a few different ways that we can understand this story. We can understand this story as Ben Rosenstein as a kind of analog to a trans man today, and say, Ben Rosenstein was accidentally, raised as a girl, but when he came to know his own true male identity, he took on a male name, he took on male pronouns, and lived a male life. That's one way of understanding the story. Another way of understanding the story would be to say this is an analog to butch lesbian identity, and that Ben Rosenstein, found herself drawn, or we could even say, like, I know there are some people who identify like a he, him lesbian, right? You could say Ben Rosenstein was part of a lesbian relationship, but in order to live in the world, had to live outwardly with a man's name and male pronouns, in order to make their relationship legible and understandable to other people. Or we could say, Ben Rosenstein should really be understood as a non-binary, as a gender queer or gender transgressive, and all of these are possible readings. I'm not claiming to know any one true story here. Mm-hmm. But so that's the story that I present in the book. I present Ben Rosenstein, I present their, this newspaper article. But what becomes moving to me when this story gets out into the Jewish community, and in particular in Chicago, where Ben Rosenstein died, is that it turns out that Ben Rosenstein is buried in the Jewish cemetery in Chicago, in the Waldheim Jewish Cemetery. But because they were rejected by their family and didn't have, and they were sort of pretty, poor immigrant circumstances, they were buried in the paupers section, in the like free burial section, with no headstone, with no tombstone. And one of the big synagogues in Chicago invited me to speak, and I spoke about this story, and they were so struck by the truth that like this was someone who was in their city, who was connected to their history, and yet was like not part of their understanding of how their community came to be. And they were so, it was so important for them to right this historical wrong that they adopted Ben Rosenstein as a member of the synagogue, sort of posthumously, put him on the yahrzeit list for the synagogue membership, and did a fundraising effort to put up a tombstone, to put up a headstone for Ben Rosenstein, which they did. Unfortunately, the unveiling was postponed due to our current pandemic. But there is now a headstone in the Chicago Jewish Cemetery that says Ben Rosenstein on it, and that honors, and the inscription that they chose, which, and I give credit here to the rabbis of Anshe Emet Synagogue, they chose the inscription from Psalms. The stone which the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Even masu habonim hayta l'rosh pina. And that's such a, I thought that was so the right sentiment. First of all, Ben Rosenstein was a construction worker. He was someone who like built things with his hands. So I love the idea of honoring like the labor that it takes to make buildings and furniture and houses, and how often that labor is unrecognized. But also in a metaphorical and spiritual sense, that again, the process of ongoing engagement with our history means constantly circling back and finding, actually, our narrative rests on these silent, unacknowledged cornerstones, these kinds of absences that actually build our story. We have to constantly be going back and finding them. So that's one example. The second example is another story in my book of a man named Moïse Zekri, who was born in Algeria in the late 19th century, moved to France, as was common, around 1900, and opened a gay bar in Paris. Really the first gay bar to have any substantial, there was like one gay bar that was open for 2 months and then it closed. So technically it was the second gay bar in Paris, but it was sort of the first real impactful gay bar in Paris. And he faced all kinds of harassment and police surveillance, and partially because he's sitting at the intersection of Jewish identity, right, gay identity, and also Algerian identity, right? So there's also anti-Arab and even Islamophobic sentiment that gets overlaid, even though he's Jewish, like they kind of all get layered on top of his story here. And the bar ends up being closed, and he goes on and does other things. But so how does the story get taken up? I was contacted by an Israeli filmmaker, actually a pair of Israeli filmmakers, themselves identifying as a member of the LGBTQ community, themselves of North African Jewish origin, who had been struggling to find like what it meant for them as a queer North African Jew, right? I think they're of mixed Moroccan, Algerian, or Moroccan Tunisian heritage, to say, I feel very strongly, I feel my belonging and rootedness in the queer community. And I feel very strongly my belonging and rootedness in my family heritage as a North African Jew. But I can't find where those identities meet. I can't find what's the bridge that allows me to see the wholeness of myself, where I don't have to pretend to be half of myself when I go home and visit my family and half of myself when I hang out in the queer bars in Tel Aviv today. And they were so moved by the story of Moise Zekri, who had kind of had done this 100 years ago, that they are now making a film about the life and death of Moise Zekri. And I was very happy to see, they just wrote me to say they got a grant to support their film project, and they're going out and they're going to go to France and go to Algeria and do all this research and filmmaking, and it's going to be wonderful. And this is the kind of thing that I had hoped for when I wrote this book, because I'm a historian, and I see my job as bringing access to history to the public. But the job of the audience, the job of the readership, is now to take those stories and do things with them, and write novels and PJ Library books and films and Broadway musicals. I think about Indecent, right? This wonderful Broadway musical of Paula Vogel's, based on the Yiddish play God of Vengeance, which is represented in the anthology. It's sold out theaters all over the world. People are lining up at the door to see creative retellings of stories from our LGBTQ Jewish past. So to me, I was when I saw Indecent, I thought, this is amazing. Out of the 120 entries in my book, God of Vengeance is one of them. So there's 119 other Broadway musicals that could be written here, about different times and places and different stories and different kinds of questions that people have faced. So, now Moise Zekri is going to be a movie, so that's 118, to go.
Wow. Yeah. And that just reminds me of a line from your introduction that really struck me and stuck out to me. To those who find themselves in these pages, may it bring you courage to continue living, loving, and fighting for a better future. And I think a way to do that is to take what you've so lovingly put together in your book and encouraging folks to then keep doing the work and to keep finding themselves and giving that gift of representation and visibility and those stories that we craved for the next generations to come. So that's beautiful. And Micah and I would love to know, Noam, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is, paradoxically, not knowing what the future will hold. I think historians are often asked to be fortune tellers. Now that we know the past, will that tell us what's going to happen in the future? And I think the lesson of history, if there is a lesson of history, is actually precisely that we don't know what's going to happen in the future. I think, out of anyone, historians are the least likely in some ways, because we know just how unpredictable and how contingent and how whatever the opposite of inevitable is, evitable, how much history is made by the people who are living in it each day. Each of us faces millions of little choices. And I have no idea, no way of knowing how those choices are going to go. So that's actually tremendously hopeful, is a willingness to not know what's going to happen, and an awareness that the past doesn't predict our future. If anything, the past offers us possibilities for a myriad of futures. Like there are an infinite number of possible futures that are contained in our present and in our past. And by going back to the past, we can help discern which of those possible futures we want to work toward. But knowing that all of those possible futures are encoded in the past is tremendously hopeful, because it means that the future that I might see us heading toward is not inevitable. We don't have to go to that future. We don't have to choose that path. We can create a different future. We have the power to do that. Any of us can work towards creating a different future now. So that gives me immense hope.
Amen, amen. I'm like tearing up to hear you say that and to hear you paint a picture of what history can build for us. And I think that we couldn't find a better note to close this conversation on. But I want to lift that up, and I want to take us through a quick game, a couple of silly, uplifting questions to put a smile on our face as we leave the conversation. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Ooh, all right, taking a deep breath. So first, what's your favorite food?
Oh, what is my favorite food? I will say probably chocolate ice cream.
Ooh, nice. What is one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
You don't have to cut your hair if you don't want to.
It's a good one.
Love it. If you could choose, or if you were in some sort of alternate world in which you had to choose any other profession besides what you do now, what would that be?
I would want to be a chef on a houseboat that goes like a floating bed and breakfast.
Cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
A possible future.
That's a great possible future. Here's another possible future. If you had a pet elephant, what would you name it?
Oh. I've never, I can't say I've ever considered that. If I had a pet elephant, what would I name it? I'd probably choose some like historical figure who was connected to elephants in some way, like Hannibal. Or like one of the Maccabees. Wasn't Simon, there was a Maccabee who was fighting with elephants? Simon? Yeah, some like nerdy historical reference, probably.
Love it. Last question. What is a word that makes you feel empowered?
What's a word? I have to say the word author. The word that I struggle with. People often describe me as an author, and I think I struggle with it precisely because it holds so much power. Mm-hmm. Do I dare write my own life? Do I dare be the author? I think I'm still wrestling with that, but the idea that any of us can author our lives, can author our stories, can author ourselves into the world holds tremendous power for me, and I think for all of us.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you. Noam, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing and for educating us. It was a true delight. And thank you for all of you for watching and or listening. Don't forget to check out resources, other videos and information at Keshet, about Keshet at www.keshetonline.org, and stay tuned for next week's episode. Once again, thank you so much, Noam. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.